Hi, good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN, a nonprofit that presents programs exploring human development across the lifespan. I'm honored to welcome you to tonight's conversation between Nicholas Thompson and David Epstein. Thanks for joining us. FAN's YouTube channel includes an archive of nearly 400 recordings of past events. I invite you to subscribe for updates when new conversations are posted. And now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's guests. Nicholas Thompson is the CEO of The Atlantic, a position he has held since 2021. He was previously editor-in-chief at Wired and editor of NewYorker.com. Nick films a daily video on tech policy for LinkedIn and writes a monthly newsletter, The Most Interesting Reads, about the best things he has read recently. He has long been a competitive runner, and in 2021, he set the American record for men 45 and over in the 50K race. And what a pleasure to welcome David Epstein back to FAN. David is a science writer and author of the New York Times bestsellers Range and The Sports Gene. He was previously an investigative reporter at ProPublica and before that, a senior writer at Sports Illustrated. His two TED Talks on human development and performance have been viewed more than 12 million times. David's forthcoming book, Inside the Box: How Constraints Make Us Better, will be published in May of 2026, and we are already busy planning an event with him. Please join me in warmly welcoming Nick Thompson and David Epstein to FAN.
Thank you very much, Sonny. And thank you, Nick, for allowing me to do this. Nick, can you hear me okay? Just checking that I unmuted myself sufficiently.
You sound
Great.
great. Thank you for the kind words, Lonnie. Thank you, David. Delighted to be here with you.
So I first want to talk about a little bit about the structure of this book because it's so unique. So just
Yeah.
before I started reading it, I had finished a book by Laszlo Krasznahorkai, the Hungarian writer who just won the Nobel Prize, and it was called Satan Tango. And the book is about a communist era work estate that falls into decay. And the tango in the title is because the first 6 chapters are people sort of taking steps toward hope, and the next 6 equal steps back from that. And it made me think of how there's not nearly as much structural innovation in nonfiction as is in fiction. I read your book right after this and was like,
Oh,
here is some innovation in nonfiction because this is a memoir, but it's almost like a parallel memoir of your running and aging, your father, who's this incredibly inspiring, intelligent, and very self-destructive figure, interspersed with kind of vignettes of other runners who come into your life, and how running interacts with their ability to like handle life challenges.
yeah.
So I was wondering if you could just start with describing a little bit about how you conceived the structure of this book, because I think it was really unusual and really quite refreshing because I don't think there's kind of enough of these structural experiments in nonfiction writing.
Sure. So there are really 4 stories in the book. There's my father's life, there's my life, there are these stories of these other runners, and then there's the sort of the physiology and science of my thinking about running. And what I tried to do is I tried to lay out the book so that it could be as chronological as possible, just because that's the easiest structure to absorb. And even subconsciously, we are able to follow things much better when they're chronological. And I made this broad map because there's an obvious problem once I've told you that, which is that the chronology of my dad's life and my life and these different runners, of course, different. If I told it all chronologically, it would just be my dad's life. And then, he's 33 when I'm born. Um, and so I came up with a pretty interesting structure where I start with a description of what happens in one particular race of mine. So it's a chronological cheat. I start the book in 2007, and I tell you everything that happens in my mind during one race. And I do that in order to get an emotional connection with the reader, and so the reader knows what they're reading and who I am. Because if I just were to go back and like tell my dad's story and my childhood story, nobody would care. So develop the emotional connection. And then from there, it's chronological with a few cheats. I tell my father's time at high school. He went to Phillips Academy Andover, and then my time at high school, Phillips Academy Andover. My father's time at Stanford, my time at Stanford. And then I run us both along the same chronological track until he dies in 2017. But that's only about halfway through the book. And so I then bring my father up again later, but at those points I'm attaching the themes that are important to moments in my life where I discovered things about him. So suddenly his life is on my chronology. Then I take these runners, and they're all runners who I interacted with or who I knew. And so one, for example, was a This guy named Tony Ruiz, who was my coach when I was 30, who uses running as a way to overcome a really terrible heroin addiction. And he comes into the story, and I tell his life story from the time he's born until the present day, starting at the moment he intersects with my life. And so that's the structure. It's my dad's life, my life, running kind of parallel. And then these runners who pop in to my life wherever I meet them, and then their life stretches out, and then we come back to the narrative.
I mean, I thought that was an incredibly effective structure. And at first, I thought I was just reading vignettes of runners, and then I was like, no, these are vignettes. These are like miniature biographies of how running allowed these people to confront, grief, childhood
Yeah.
trouble, someone who misses the Olympics by a tenth of a second. So I thought that was fascinating. But I do think we need to talk about your father
Yeah.
because he's such an interesting presence in the book. And you have this line in the book. You say, when people ask me what my parents did for a living, I would generally answer my mother's an art historian and my father runs a male brothel in Bali. Um, Obviously, as a child, you have to get to a pretty unusual place for that to be how you answer what your father did. So I want to just read a paragraph from a eulogy you gave for your
Yeah.
father. He said, Dad was never boring. If given two choices, he would always take the more interesting one. If he saw the opportunity to have an argument, he would start one. If given the chance to go somewhere or do something or meet someone, he would say yes. If he saw a flaw in your personality or someone else's, he would point it out. He liked complicated music, complicated people, complicated financial transactions. He drove fast and parked in places he shouldn't have. If he saw a steep hill in the road, he accelerated to make it feel like a roller coaster. He fell in love rapidly. Every 6 months in his last years, he would proclaim that he was getting married to yet another man who he insisted was the love of his life. He would then inevitably ask if I could find a priest and host a Catholic wedding in the Catskills. I would then have to respond that American law had grown tolerant of gay marriage, but it was still not ready for bigamy. He was the first openly gay presidential appointee in the United States, and surely the first person to host rooftop parties in Manila that consisted 50% of the former president of the country and his entourage and 50% of my father's young gay friends. This is not a man who anyone easily forgets. So there is a lot in there. The
Yeah,
first,
it's amazing. I was laughing at that. Just that was the eulogy. I haven't read that in a long time. I wrote that right when he died. That wasn't in the book, but yeah,
the
remarkable man.
first openly gay presidential appointee in the United States. And I mean, this makes him sound energetic and inspiring, but also for a child to eventually be writing those things about their father. Um, it's an unusual journey. So I'm wondering if you can just tell us a little bit about who your father was, because even in the part of the book after he passes away, he's a looming, towering figure around every one of your achievements and thoughts in the book. So I'm wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about him.
Well, he'll be a looming, towering figure, for my entire life. He was a remarkable man. He grows up in, complicated situation in Oklahoma in a family that where he's not, he doesn't feel loved. His father wants him to be someone else. His father's a big, traditionally masculine man, Golden Gloves boxing champion, minister. And my dad wants to listen to music and read books, and he's incredibly smart. And so my dad kind of breaks out and he finds out about a school called Andover, applies in secret, gets in, gets a scholarship, succeeds, goes to Stanford, same thing, gets a scholarship, described in recommendation letters by the president as the best student we've had since Herbert Hoover. John F. Kennedy comes to campus and is like, this kid's going to get to the White House before me. So my dad's on top of the world, wins a Rhodes Scholarship, goes to Oxford, comes back, marries my mother. My mother comes from this elite, wonderful DC family. And so my dad is really on top of the world. But success is hard once he's back from Oxford. And life doesn't work the way he doesn't get on political track. He doesn't really, nothing works. And then by the late 1970s, he realizes he's gay. And this is a very hard realization, particularly for someone who has, big political aspirations and wants to be part of this New England elite. And then he leaves, he divorces my mother, he moves to Washington, and then life is just a tempest, right? I didn't know him when, obviously before I was born, but watching and observing him and watching just the kind of out of control energy, the self-destructive processes, as you've mentioned, the alcohol intake. He lives a life where, like I said in that eulogy, everybody enjoys talking to him. Everybody enjoys being with him. He's fun and he's interesting, but he just can't get anything done, right? His best book is this book he writes when he's 25 years old. He doesn't really get a good job. He can't, sort things out. And eventually he gives up on America. He moves to Southeast Asia. He starts this hotel that's not really a hotel, and he gets kind of undone by a sexual addiction. And the cause of the sexual addiction is unclear. It's potentially, he would often say it was because he'd stayed closeted until he was 40, so he didn't have a coming of age as a young heterosexual, as a young homosexual man. I felt like, as I worked on the book, there's a very traumatic moment in my father's life, which comes coincidentally about the same week I start running for the high school track team, where one of his closest friends, who was quite similar to him, closeted man who also had been a Rhodes Scholar, also been photographed in Life magazine at his college graduation, um, becomes very close to my dad and then kills himself in my father's garage. And to my father, the suicide, this man named Roger Hansen, there's a wonderful book written about him called Remembering Denny by Calvin Trillin. I think to my father, the lesson of that was if you stay closeted and if you hide it, you will create demons inside of yourself that you can't control. And so my father kind of spins out and becomes not just openly gay, but like you couldn't have a conversation with him talking about his sex life. Becomes like overwhelmingly, the love not dare not speak his name became the love that could not shut up, right? And he becomes so obsessed with bringing his sex life into every conversation and so obsessed with like never spending the night alone that actually becomes part of his undoing.
And so you stole my line there. I love that line in the book. The love that dare not speak its name became the love that wouldn't shut up. And you mentioned, um, that he leaves the family, but he doesn't just leave the family. I mean, he sort of ties your mom up with legal stuff, right? And his destructive habits like reach to you. I mean, and there's a poignant scene in the book, like one after another, and just like that made me feel kind of grateful for not having to deal with some of those things with my father. Like you go to a club and you log into like a public computer and his profile looking for like male escorts or something is still logged in
Yeah,
to the
not just
computer.
a club. I go to the Metropolitan Club, which is like it's 1 block from the White House, right? It's like there's senators, congressmen, lobbyists. It's a very prominent. You have to wear a jacket and tie to get into this place. You're not allowed to. If you were dressed like me, you would not be allowed in the front door. And yet, on the one public computer, you open it up and it says, "Hello, Scotty," and this naked, skinny guy pops up. And that had been the case for at least a month when I logged on because he had left the country a month before.
Yeah, so this is like incredible stuff for a child to go through. And the scenes are just one after another amazing. Like he'll write you a note and say, I just took the pills, I'm about to die. But then if you like wire him a little bit of money, he's like, I'm good again. And he's like giving you reading recommendations, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, it's just an incredible thing to deal with. And there's this
Yeah.
kind of like looming ghost in the book where he warns you repeatedly that at 40, your life is done. Like that's the age at which he'd run his fastest race, right? And that it's kind of downhill from there. And I'm curious how that affected you to hear that from your father and to kind of see him as an example of it and saying like, look, this is what's going to happen to you.
I mean, I think what it did is it made me desperate not to have that happen to me. I mean, I love so much about my father, and I wish sometimes I had the energy levels of my father, right? But what I'm very grateful of is I don't have the addictions and I don't have I have the discipline that he didn't have. And so in some ways, what the lesson of my father was to never take my hand off the wheel, right? And maybe when my kids read a memoir about me, they'll be like, Dad was like too focused on his to-do list like his whole life. But I feel like it's very my life works pretty well right now. I have these three amazing kids. I have a wonderful wife. I have a great job. I'm very fortunate in all these things. And I also feel like I'm like an inch away from something going wrong, right? And it's part because of watching my dad and just not wanting to be this way. So I try very hard to kind of maintain my discipline, keep focused, keep kind of moving forward effectively every day so that I don't end up like him. Because I'm not sure, back to what you said, where he told me life would fall apart about 40. His life had kind of fallen apart at 40. That's when he came out of the closet. That's when, his sort of professional aspirations went kaput. His father's life had fallen apart at 40. That's when there was like a sort of a trauma in the family, and my grandfather resigned this position that he'd cared so much about, and he spent the rest of his life drinking and trying to catch up to it. And so it's multiple examples of men in my family where things went haywire at 40. And so there are cultural reasons why 40 is a hard age. You're taking care of your kids. You're supposed to be at the apex of you can no longer use youth as excuse for whatever sort of professional things you haven't accomplished. You're dealing with your parents. There's like a lot of pressure on you at that moment in life. And I wanted to like study that in a way and not end up like that.
Can you share a little bit about, because this memoir, it's a parallel. So it talked a little bit about how it's not a traditional memoir, but there's also so much that's out of it, like left out of it, as you're writing about running. It's kind of a memoir of you via
Yeah.
running and via your father, and that's so apparent because it does touch on your professional life quite a bit. But there are things like, and I got kidnapped by some drug dealers in Morocco one time. And you don't go into those because it's not a memoir of like your whole life. That ends up being sort of a one day affair, right? Where these like
Yeah.
very unprofessional drug dealers try to get you to smuggle drugs and you say no and you're basically gone. But that makes it so obvious that you're kind of like picking and choosing in this biography or memoir. So what can you share a little bit of your early memories of your father's running and how that sort of became a link between the two of you and eventually something in which you know, you you surpassed him, obviously.
Well, so on the point about the memoir, I've had very hard. Every detail is about my life and running or my life and my father. And I worked at the New Yorker, amazing place. I worked there for 6 years. There are books after books after books written about those years and written about the New Yorker. There's like 2 pages in my book because I dealt with running, and so I dealt with how I covered the Boston Marathon. Um, I started two whole companies during this and sold them, and neither of them is mentioned, I think, in the book. Um, they didn't relate to my running. My early memories of my father. I When he was 5 or 6 and we still lived in our house in Brookline, he would run with me and we'd run around the block, Crammond Street, Lapland Road, Heath Street. And 2.5 times, I think, and you'd start at where the car parked, you'd go around the beach street. I remember running that. I remember running a mile. I remember what that felt like. And I remember him coming in and out of the front door. I was 5, 6, sweaty, but also like impassioned and invigorated. And you can read, like I read his old diary notes, and when he would run, a couple miles, he was proud. And I remember that. And those are moments of just sort of loving, wonderful memories. He adored me and he adored my older sister. She's a year older than me. And then he divorced my mother and he moves to Washington. And then I remember this is when he's training seriously. So I'm 7, 8, 9. And I remember he would go run 20 miles in the morning and come back, have orange juice and seltzer. And I remember him like leaving before I got up. And I remember his like big, thick gray New Balance shoes and you know, his shorts and his headband, very early 80s running. And I loved
Mm.
that. And then later, by the time I'm 11, 12, 13, 14, we would go running when we were together. We'd go run 2 miles. I'd come down to Washington and we'd run, or we'd run out on the roads by his farm in Virginia. And then we kept doing that through my 20s and 30s, even as I became a good runner. He and I would run, I guess not through my 30s, maybe through our 20s. We would go and run a few miles together whenever we were together. It's just running is a beautiful way. It's like driving, right? When you drive, you're you're not looking directly at each other. And in some ways, you can sometimes have better conversations. It takes a little bit of the emotional pressure off. And maybe for two men, sometimes men can have really good conversations while watching a sports game, right? Or you're at a baseball game and you're watching the baseball game, you can have a really hard conversation. You're hiking and your running can be a really good way to have a conversation too. And sometimes just sitting across from each other, there can be too much pressure or it doesn't work as well. So my dad and I had good conversations while we ran.
And I should say, move more into the running in a minute, but not off your dad quite yet. But just for people who are interested in running, I mean, I think I've read a lot of literature about running, and I think there are passages in this book that are like as beautiful about running as any running writing that I've read.
Thank you.
So people who run and anyone who's a habitual runner reads about running. It's like everyone who's into running. It's like all you want to do is you have like an infinite capacity to talk about and read about running. So they should read it. But before going away from your dad, I want to read just in the book, you print the email that he sends you shortly before he dies. And you note that he goes into kind of deep terrain. He keeps referencing the biological roots of his sexuality, which he called his DNA imposed limits and his kind of career frustrations. In his email, he writes, this is his writing, despite the separation in our family necessitated by something difficult with which to deal, in my DNA no less, we managed to develop some remarkable bonds. You helped me through a most difficult period of midlife. You went to Andover and Stanford. It's selfish, but I hope Ellis does likewise. You now rise far above what I even dreamed of professionally, once I'd accepted my DNA imposed limits. We are all so proud. But please give Wired a New Yorker style one-page table of contents. It's so tedious to peruse the magazine now. And then he tells you to remember to read the 23rd book of the Iliad, and then says, maybe my half of your DNA has been worth something along the way. It's enough for many lives. I'm inherently happy and positive about life, ready to die fulfilled, hoping with good reason to have 15 more. Proudly, happily, love, Dad. And he dies shortly after that. And it's, even though he's kind of off the rails by this point in the book, it's still a sad thing when he says, I'm ready to die, but hoping to have 15 more. And he's been such a big presence in the book. And I was thinking about my own writing when I was reading this and how I don't know what I think about something until I've attempted to write about it.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, with everything you've been through in with your dad, were there things you learned about him or learned that you thought about him that you didn't realize until you did this writing?
Yes. I think that there were many things I learned about him. I learned a lot more about his youth. We hadn't talked that much about it, or I hadn't listened when we had. But I went back. He left this great trove of material, his diaries, he didn't leave them, I found them. His diaries, his letters. He left some memoirs. And then there's a book which I have actually right back there on my shelf, about my grandfather. It was a self-published book that, sold zero copies. But I read it and I read some of his sermons. And so I learned a lot about my father's father. I I think maybe the most important moment actually came, it was maybe 2 years ago, and I was trying to actually learn more about my grandfather. And I have all my letters arranged in this sort of big accordion-like folder. And I looked in, I think it was F for Francis, to see if something was there. And somehow I found this letter that I'd misfiled from my father. And it was a letter that he had written to me when I was 21, when I turned 21. And I'd kind of remembered it, but not really. And looking at it from age, I guess I would have been 48, it was the most extraordinary thing anyone's ever written about me, my whole life. And it just, it foresaw my strengths, my weaknesses. He was able to kind of look ahead at Nick at 21 and foresee. I had a rocky time between 21 and 30, professionally, emotionally. He foresaw kind of what would happen and why. And then he wrote so beautifully about some of the most cosmic themes in life, his guilt at having kind of abandoned me when I was born and I was in the NICU, and having left just my mother to care for me because he was worried I would die. And then he wrote about, at one point he says that, the love he has for me as a son is so great. And in fact, he thinks that he sublimated his sexuality for his whole life because he so desperately wanted to have a son. And to see that I was here in this world and I was doing so well was so meaningful to him. And it's just, it just knocked me straight onto the floor. And it and other documents and other thinking, I think, made me forgive him more. I mean, as you can tell from that email that you read, we were very close, right? And he loved me dearly. He's given me advice on how to change the table of contents when I became the editor-in-chief of Wired. There's another line in that. He's
Did you
saying,
do it?
I tried. The art department fought with me hard on that one. But yeah, we changed it. But we're very close, but I think I became in some ways even closer to him while writing the book.
I was wondering, you just alluded to it, but I was wondering, given the, situations of embarrassment, you obviously have a lot of understanding for things he was going through, but is there or was there a lot of anger that you had to deal with for, ways that sometimes he tried to manipulate you or your mom and leaned on you and things
I
like
didn't get
that?
mad. He leaned on me. He asked me for money. I supported him for much of his later life. Yeah, that did make me angry. Frustrated me sometimes. Only time I got truly angry at him would be when he would talk about my mother or about my mother's family. And, sometimes we'd be off running or driving or walking or sitting, and he would start to talk about them. And I would just, you know, he was just wrong. He had basic facts wrong and basic understanding wrong. He didn't understand her, and was blinded by anger. And he had these, conspiracy theories about my maternal grandfather. So I would get quite mad at him about that. But then he would usually back away. Or we would, or actually, maybe he wouldn't back away. We would just end the conversation. My sister
Hmm.
would get mad at him and then they'd fight. I would get mad at him and then it would kind of disappear.
I actually don't know the exact ages of your kids, but have any of them read this book?
They've all read it. Yeah.
Yeah. Read it. And so that must be very interesting. Did they know a lot of this stuff about their grandfather already?
No, and that was part of in some ways, the genesis of the book was writing them a long letter about him when he died. They didn't know him. They barely knew him. They didn't even think of him as their grandfather. I
He was
still don't.
already in Asia at the time, right? At
They have
the
the only mental imagery they'll have of him are from the photographs in this book. So they didn't understand him. They didn't, my mother married this amazing man. They spent a lot of time with him. They think of him as the grandfather on my side of the family. They don't think of my
Mhm, mhm.
biological father. So
Um,
crazily, in that letter you just read, which is so wild, I haven't thought about this, but you reading out loud struck me. My eldest son Ellis did just get into Stanford. He's going to go. So like that line about I hope he goes, I hadn't remembered that.
I want to move into your running because to some degree it's a book where we're watching your father age from this incredible promise to disappointment and then to kind of chaos in some
Yeah.
ways. Um, but your own aging. So both you and I were walk-on runners in college. Um, I was a 800-meter runner, so not the
You
sort
were a
of
better
distance.
walk-on than I was, but we were both
Uh,
walk-ons. It's true.
that's right. I got good while I was still in college. You got
Yeah.
good much, much later. But there was something interesting. So you walk on at Stanford, which was like the best or one of the best distance programs in the country. So a very hard
Mhm.
place to walk on, and it doesn't really go very well. Like you're injured, other people are more talented, and you end up quitting basically. Um, and then you come back to running later, and I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that quitting at Stanford and what sort of brought you back to running later in a serious way.
That's a great question that I haven't been asked. Um, so I quit at Stanford and I told myself this story that I had quit because I hadn't tried hard enough, because I wasn't good enough. And there are these other boys, they had more talent, and I had run 9.5 minutes for 2 miles as a high school senior, and they had run 9 minutes and 5 seconds, and they were just better. And that was the story I told myself. I kept running a bit in college. I would go run in the mountains out in Palo Alto. And then I think what happened is the year after I graduated, I was adrift and I wasn't quite sure what to do. And I just had this notion that maybe I should run. And I think it was just because my dad had run when he was adrift and I had these memories of it. And so I run a marathon and I don't do very well. And so then I'm like, well, maybe I'll try to run another one. A couple years later, I try to run another one, beat my time. And so then I get into it and I get pulled into it. And then I get pulled into just sort of this every other year or so I would run a marathon and try to run 3 hours. And then then it became like a goal, like a big goal in my life. And so from age about 22 to 30, I tried really hard to break 3 hours in a marathon.
And I wonder if well, and then you break 3 hours,
Yeah.
and then you start getting really, really serious. I mean, one of the things that's interested me is that like when I think about the guys that I ran with in college, again, these were like 800-meter runners, so it's different. It's a different post-college life. Um, but some of the guys were really good, especially if they were really good, really young, often went cold turkey when they got out of college
Yep.
because they'd never really kind of run for the love of it to begin with. And then some of those who were maybe not as good or came to it a little late end up getting really serious sort of later in life. And what you were writing about that, it made me wonder, had you not quit Stanford, had you stayed on the team and things gone better, my guess, we'll never know, right? We can't know the counterfactual, but my guess is that you would ultimately not have had as fulfilling or interesting a running career. I don't know that, but it reminded me of one of my great pleasures when I was at Sports Illustrated was I became friends with Sir Roger Bannister, first man to run under 4 minutes in the mile, and then retired at 25, went on to become a world famous neurologist. But he told me that he ran in the 1950, 52 Olympics, didn't medal, He said if he had meddled, he would have retired right there.
Hmm.
But because he didn't, he kept going, and he
Yeah.
wanted his running to be part of the spiritual post-war spiritual rebuilding of Britain. And it was that, lack of achieving his goal that kind of kept him going. And I wonder if you thought there was some of that with Stanford, where you didn't quite get what you might have wanted, and maybe that sort of kept you going longer in some ways.
I think that is definitely part of it. I think there are a couple factors. I think that if you're very good at that young age, you can do a lot of long-term harm, right? Because you feel so strong and you run like 120 miles a week and you're burning yourself. And so I think some of the reasons that the elites, like in my college group, didn't keep running is just because they fried themselves. Secondly, it's very hard to get worse at something, right? It's not a lot of fun. And
Yeah,
if you run like a 2:15 marathon when you're 21, it's really not fun to run a 2:40 when you're 30, right?
right.
But if you haven't done that, it is kind of cool to run a 2:40 when you're 30. And so in my mind, there's no question that if I had done well at Stanford, I would not be running now. I would have stopped and I would have had a picture of me like on the Stanford cross country team, like on the wall or something, and that would be it. Um, so I'm blessed. It is a really interesting thing, and it also raises this interesting question, right? So okay, if that's true, Nick, how are you going to keep running at 50 as you start getting worse? Like this is something I'm now dealing with. Like I'm now legitimately worse than I was a couple of years ago. It does seem like this age-related decline that I held off for until age 48 is now coming for me. And so we'll see if I can keep
Well,
it
you just
going.
moved to new events, right? Is that why you moved to the 50K, and where you're again, 45, age 45 and up, North American record holder still in
Yeah,
50K?
still am, still am. Yeah,
Uh,
that's partly why I started running longer distances. Yeah, because it's
I
no
love that.
fun
I
to
mean,
go and run marathons and just stink in them.
right. So you just find some new thing. That's why I love there's like all this research about how when people have hobbies that kind of are unrelated, if they're unrelated enough to their work, it improves their feelings of self-efficacy, like their ability to take on challenges. And I think it's like
Yeah.
you should keep moving to something where you're not only competing with your previous self. And
Yes.
and in many ways, this is a book in many ways about aging, and in some ways the degree to which some aspects of aging are kind of a choice, right? Like
Hmm.
of all the
Yeah.
things, running faster is associated with youth, right? So simple. And yet, even there, this book is kind of like a triumph of wisdom over youth in just getting faster. Like you learn all this stuff. I mean, you become part of this coaching experiment.
Hmm.
So you just talked about struggling to break 3 hours in the marathon. Then you get much faster and you become what I guess your friends or peers call Mr. 243, where you're running like 243 or thereabouts over and over and over again in the
Yeah.
marathon, right? Which is quite fast. Like
That's
now
great.
you're way down from someone who's running below three, but you're running 243, 243, 243 over. What ages are we talking there where you're running 243 over and over again?
Age 30 to age 43.
Okay. So you age 30 to 43, you have no business thinking you're going to get faster
Right.
at that point, right? And yet what happens when you become, can you describe a little bit a part of this kind of coaching experiment that you become part of and what happens?
Yeah, it's amazing. And so it's a year after my father dies, and I get an email from Nike, and they know that I'm a pretty good runner, that I've run a 2:43 marathon.
What
And
mile
I
pace is that? Do you know off the top of your head for people who might be interested in their own runs?
would say again, what race?
Do you know what mile pace 243 is, just for people who might be
It's like
thinking about their own
6:10 to
runs?
6:15.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe it's 6:15. And
Okay.
so I'd run a 2:43 marathon, and then Nike reaches out and they say, "Hey, we're doing this experiment where we're going to take regular runners and give them elite coaching and see what happens. And do you want to do it?" And I didn't write back immediately and say yes because I was like, God, this running habit takes a lot of time. I'm the editor of Wired, but my father had died a year before, and sort of coincidentally, the I think got the email on a Tuesday or Wednesday. I usually write back very quickly, and I didn't write back. And then that weekend, I had a college reunion. I think my 25th high school reunion. And I went out and I ran the hill that I used to, a friend of mine from the team had died. And I went out and I ran the hill. It was a very emotional experience where he and I had so much fun together when we were young. And something about that run and something about thinking about my dad, I just said, I'm going to go for it. I'm going to try to go fast. And so I said yes to Nike. And they then paired me with these great coaches. And I kind of thought that maybe if it went perfectly, I could run like 2:40. Um, but they start changing everything about the way I train. I train much harder. I start adding more structured workouts. I train my diet, change the way I cross train. And then I go through this crazy progression where I run the first race, I run 2:38. Whoa. And then I run 2:34. And then I run 2:29, which is a whole different world from
In
2:48.
Chicago, right? In Chicago
Yeah.
Marathon.
Yeah.
It's always a good place to go for a PR.
So that's a 5:41 mile pace, which is insane for 26 miles, particularly when, you've barely been able to run that for 3 miles, a year before. So, what did they teach me? If I were to go through the lessons, they taught me some technical things, like how to measure my heart rate properly while I ran, and then to be able to track it in like different paces, like different zones to run in, which, I did have the advantage of advanced shoe technology. But I really think what they did is they created an opening where I could believe in myself. And I hadn't, like, in a way, I hadn't believed I could go faster because I'd been stuck for so long. And they just sort of helped me break through my self-doubt. And then I was able to get much closer to my potential. And who knows how fast I would have gotten. I felt like the next cycle, I felt like I was going to go 2:24 or something, but then COVID hit and everything went to hell.
You mentioned that belief because we skipped over something else important in the book, which is when you were quite young, right after running a marathon, you get diagnosed with thyroid cancer
Yeah.
at like age
30.
30 or something like that, 30.
Yeah.
And your goal when you come, you can't do anything when you're weakened, you have these surgeries, things like that. Your goal becomes to get back to where you were pre-cancer.
Yeah.
And that's an amazing goal. At the same time, do you think that was kind of limiting you in a way?
Totally. 100%. Yeah. So I go through this intense treatment. You can see it's still there, how many years later are we? 20 years later. Um, and yeah, I really, in some ways, just at a deep psychological level, both had the goal only of being as fast as I'd been before I got sick, and maybe didn't believe I could be faster than I had been before I got sick. And that was hugely self-limiting because if I could run at 2:29 at age 44, I surely could have gone faster at 34. Like you know, there are biological advantages of getting older in marathon in years and years, but there are a lot more biological advantages of being
Yes.
younger.
Yeah.
And um, but I didn't. I guess I just didn't think I could do it. And I don't. And it wasn't like I considered it and rejected it. I just never considered it. I never considered the possibility that I could go that fast.
So it's interesting to see you run the same time. It's like one thing if someone runs 2:43 once or even twice, and then you're like, all right, this is pretty much the level they're at. And then all of a sudden you jump down to 2:29, which is like a different world from
Yeah.
2:43. And one of the things that seemed to me that the coaches helped you do was realize like that you could get more training in with your job and your very
Yeah.
intense work life. And that's actually one of my favorite things in the book is that you give this insight into like you're running to and from work. You're commuting like the world is kind of your, let me see if I can find this like quick passage. The world's kind of your gym. Here, let me read this passage that I love.
Yeah.
I love this because it reminded me of an interview I did with a woman who at one time was like one of the best ultra marathoners in the world. And when I interviewed her for my first book, had a flight delay in LaGuardia. And so she was talking to me while running circles around the parking structure because she was like, people think I go on 50-mile runs. I'm like, no, I do exercise snacking. It's like if
Yeah.
I have a few minutes, I do it. And if I have a few minutes some other time. So it's like really fitting it into life. And there's a lot of that picture there because I think a lot of people get hung up on like, I got to change into the right clothes. I need this whole block of time.
Yep.
And I love that you showed us all these like little ways that you could work stuff in. So I want to read this quick passage that I labeled World is Your Gym on my notes here.
I love that.
It was in these years that I learned the most vital running lesson of my life. The weather is always good enough to run in, and there's always a spot to go. I'll run in 100-degree heat with ice tucked into my hat, and when it's 15 below with Vaseline rubbed on my nose. I'll run in hail and in a dust storm. I'll run circles around a driveway or a parking lot if that's the only place to go. I've disobeyed 1,000 no trespassing signs and been chased by a dozen dogs, at least one cow, and a lemur. A cop in New Hampshire once called my running to a halt, thinking I was a prison escapee. I've run through Times Square at midnight. I once ran around Las Vegas in shorts and a ski jacket because I forgot to bring a t-shirt on a trip. I've run to black tie events with my tux in my backpack and changed in the men's room. I've jogged to airports and headed right to the security line. And there are other parts where like you're prepping for a trail race. So, you use the curb or whatever it is to balance on. It's just like that's one of the coolest things in the book for people thinking about their own exercising and running is seeing you with these incredibly demanding jobs, getting it done,
Yeah.
basically, like working it in no matter what you have to do.
No, I like, I don't know, I stand on one leg when I brush my teeth because it's a way, like if you're training for a running race, you should do a lot of like one-legged exercises, but there's no time to do that. But you have to brush your teeth, so you might as well add them together. And, it sometimes drives my wife crazy, but I barely do, I don't do hip lifts, I don't do planks, I don't do push-ups because there's no time unless I'm like watching TV with my wife and kids. And then I'm like doing planks and push-ups and they're like, Dad, I try to get out of the field of view. But you've got to get it in. If your life is complicated, you do what you can.
And you can get it in, and you can get
Yeah.
it in. I mean, I think you even have a scene where you're like, the kids understand that dad's going to be planking on the sideline of the soccer game or whatever it is. And you know what? Why not?
And
Uh,
actually, there was this great moment. It's not in the book, but it happened recently where I was like doing airplanes. You know that thing where you like lift your knee up to one arm and then you spread your arms out and kick. It looks a little dorky. And I'm doing it on the sideline, and my son Zachary's team is like playing soccer, and they're running around, and I can overhear them. One of them's like, "Who's that weird dude doing those stretches on the sideline?" And this other kid goes, "That's Zach's dad, man. That dude runs a 4-minute mile." And I was like, "That's awesome."
That's really funny. Um, this reminds me, there were some questions that were sent in before, and we can't get to all of them, but several of them revolved around people asking. One I know was someone who said, "I'm 70 and I want to start running. How do I start?" Someone else just said, how do I get started running?" Someone else said, "What advice would you now give to beginning runners?" So a lot of them revolved around people wanting to get started or advice you'd give to beginners. And I'm wondering what you'd say to those in general.
Totally. So that I do have advice for that. So one piece of advice is there's a woman I read about in a book named Superbell Beck Jordan, and she becomes, the world's greatest multi-day ultra runner. And she started just by running lampposts. She was like, I'm going to run from my house to one lamppost and back, and I'm going to run from my house to two lampposts and back. And she has these very basic goals, but like physical, specific goals. And another thing that I think is really great. So I think that's a good goal. I'm going to run. I was talking to a guy interviewing who was having like a real weight loss. And he's like, all I want to do is be able to run around my car twice, right? Um, like whatever your goal is, you do it. And if you do it, you'll get better and you can do more. And then you can run around your car 10 times or run 10 lampposts, or as she does, run 3,000 miles around a block in Queens. So that's one thing. Another thing I'll say is this, which is when you go for a run, don't like put on your headphones and put on music. Like just listen. Go out there and listen. And then like kind of close your ears and just open your eyes. And then like focus on your smell and then focus on your feet hitting the ground. And if you do that when you run, you'll get kind of the meditative experience with it. And it adds like a real emotional mental layer that you don't get if you're just like, I'm going to go run a mile, right? And you put on your headphones, you put on your coat, you go run a mile and you finish, you're like, done. You go out there and you're like, I'm going to go run for 10 minutes and I'm just going to listen. It's a very different experience. And I think a more rewarding one, most likely, which will make you keep doing it.
There is a lot of that. That reminded me of one point in one of the vignette biographies where you mentioned that as running became more popular in the United States, that it's something that's running counter to all these other trends of like fracturing our attention and
Yeah.
not living where our feet are, as I think I saw an MIT professor describe it. We are forever elsewhere now,
Yeah.
right? But when you're running, you are where you are. And so I thought that was beautiful. And one of my sort of takeaways from the book, even being an experienced runner, was just a reminder for how hard you have to relax in some ways, right? Like you're describing some of your marathons or long runs, and you're like not wanting to turn your head to check your watch because you don't need to see it. And you're saving every ounce of that energy and just tuning into your body. I always think of this like when I'm running as being like some kind of vehicle and I'm checking my systems, like that all the needles are sort of just staying in the middle and nothing's going to red. And even though I know all that stuff, it was kind of a great uh, reminder about like how precisely you can kind of calibrate your effort and stay just below that red line, and it'll allow you to go a lot farther. Like so much of the discipline, one of the really challenges I think, especially for beginning runner, no, actually for everybody, is like to get farther in the long run, you have to do a ton of holding back
Yeah.
just below that red line. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean that's a lesson for life too. I mean, it's I think one of there's certain lessons that come from or skills you learn in running that apply to the rest of life, which is, if you're going to run a marathon at your top speed, you will feel no pain for the first 13.1 miles. Like, and if you feel any, you've already gone too fast and you're not going to run your best marathon. And you have to like learn what it feels like to be right on the edge of that line, to be like right, because you want to be going as fast as you can without like crossing over, even an inch into the red. And it's an incredible form of discipline and pacing. And so, when I race, if I do the race well, like I know really what it should feel like at 13 miles, at 15 miles, at 18 miles. I know how you should start, what you should start to feel at 20. And I know that you should be in complete agony as you get to get towards the end.
There's what I would recommend for people who are runners is actually just to get to some of those passages and then go out on a run right after it. And I think you'll be like a little
Oh, that's
more
great.
checking and I mean,
Yeah.
that's what I did, right? Like I put it down and was like, oh, I'm gonna go on a run and I'm gonna like really relax into this run.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, I mean, even one of the trends in elite training is doing more volume below that red line so that you can one, not get injured. Because like the worst thing for everybody is you get injured, right? That's like the
Totally.
the reason that I think most people stop improving is they get hurt. And you can do more volume. Like if you go at a 7.5 or 8 out of 10 instead of at a 9 out of 10, you can just do more and
Yep.
you get better. Um, but again, you get into some of the physiology in this book. I want to read just a really short passage here because there's like an anti-aging aspect to the book, right? Like your dad tells you your life is going to fall apart starting at 40, and in fact, you like things get better for you even athletically after
Yeah.
that. And you write that runners tend to decline badly in their 30s and 40s, but the main reason we slow isn't our bodies, it's our lives. We get married, we have children, we work longer hours, our parents get sick. We have more pressing things to do with our time. Running is a sport that rewards consistent effort, and once you step away, it's hard to come back. Your body frays, which makes running less enjoyable, which accelerates the decline. People stop running because they get old. They also get old because they stop running. I love that passage because I think there is a theme through the book that some of the things that we think about aging really are a choice in a certain respect. What we assume about aging is because is not necessity. It's because we stop living in a certain way.
Yeah, I think that's right. And one of you asked this great question, which I hadn't thought a lot about, which is like, why did I come back to it in my 20s after sort of my lack of success in college? And then the other question that I sometimes think about is why did I keep going in my 30s, right? When I was sort of stalled out and I go through a lot of life transitions, right? I get through my sickness. I have this triumphant comeback. I didn't need to run after that. I then have, my first child arrives. I don't run the marathon the year he's born because, I'm too focused on him. Second child arrives, though I do run the marathon that year, and I run it the year the third child arrives. And I keep going through it, even through these very hard professional transitions, running the New York Marathon every year, sometimes the Boston Marathon. And I could have stopped at any of those points and just said, that's enough. I'll take 5 years off, right? I'll let my joints heal. I'll relax. I'll focus more, have more time for my job. And I never did. And I think part of why is I had this sense that if I stopped both, that maybe I'd lose my discipline and become more like my father. And also that if I stopped, it would like really accelerate the aging process. And that part of I've always felt young for my age. I've always felt like I was, young at 35 for 35-year-olds, and I feel reasonably young for 50-year-olds right now. And I think part of it is the running. And I worried that if I let it go, I would start getting very old.
Can you share? I just have a few minutes left, but I'm wondering if you can share. And I want to end with you reading a running passage that I
Yeah.
thought was from the book. But what were like, if you can condense in kind of a lightning round, like three specific impactful things that coaches told you, what would those be?
Coaches, like the Nike coaches or coaches throughout
Any
my
any coaches throughout your career?
my coach at Stanford, Vin Lanana, who was the one thing I learned from him is that there's almost it was like a spiritual element. He had us run barefoot after workouts, and he wanted us to connect our feet to the ground. And I thought that was actually a really great lesson, and something that has affected me for a long time. Um, I think that one of the things that the Nike coaches taught me is that um, you want your workouts. This is something I hadn't really understood before. You want your workouts to match the way you're going to run a race. And so they would always structure my workouts so that I would run like a 5:15 mile, a 5:10 mile, a 5:05 mile, because they wanted me to run my marathons faster um, than I'd done before. And then I had a recent coach for ultras that taught me something interesting, which is that actually, let me go for another lesson from the night. This is the most impactful thing. And this affects my whole philosophy of training, which is that pain, and you've written about this. Pain is not just a physical sensation, it's an emotional sensation. And what happens is your body gets scared. And so in order to limit the amount of pain you feel in a race, you have to limit the amount of fear your body has. And the way you can do that is to stress each system in your body more than it'll be stressed on race day. And so to run without drinking water, run 20 miles without drinking water, because then you'll be as dehydrated as you are on the marathon when you've run 26 miles and you do drink water. And to run when it's hot so that your body is used to running when it's extreme heat, and to run when you have indigestion. And I had this experience recently where I had a head cold. And I was like, you know what, I'm going to go run because that's going to simulate what it feels like at the end of an ultra marathon when you're completely out of it. And so the specific moment he taught me that lesson is that I had run down a mountain in old shoes and my quads hurt like hell. And I was like, this is really stupid. I shouldn't have run down the mountain in these old shoes. And he's like, no, you should have. Because what is your quads hurting? What are they doing? They're rebuilding. And what is your body going to be used to? It's going to be used to quad stress. And so when you're in a race and you're wearing good shoes, you'll be able to go much further.
It's interesting about pain, right? That there's, right, I used to write about the science of pain, and that for a given pain stimulus, well, so since like the 17th century, Rene Descartes, the reigning theory of pain was called specificity theory, where it's like you think of your nerves like a rope on a bell, and your brain is the bell, and how hard you pull the rope is how hard the bell rings. And it wasn't until like the 60s that we started replacing that and realizing that actually the brain takes the stimulus on the nerve, but integrates all these other signals. How
Yeah.
sunny it is, how much this thing you care about this thing. And the single best determinant of how much pain someone will feel for a given stimulus is how much of a catastrophizer they are.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like, to your point about fear, there's like this famous case study about a construction worker who gets a bolt through his foot on a site, and he's freaking out, and he has a new son. He's never going to be able to run with his son or play with him. They get to the hospital and saw the boot off, and they see it went between his toes, and he's immediately fine as soon as he sees it. Because it was the meaning of this situation
Yeah.
that made him feel that
Oh, that's
pain.
amazing. That's
Uh,
amazing. Yeah, totally. Totally. That makes so much sense.
or like fooling people. Have you seen these studies where you fool people about the temperature in a room and they end up cycling farther when you like change the thermostats a little bit and the
Totally.
sun?
Right. Or you tell them that it's hotter than it's going to be in there, like they feel
Yeah.
agony. Yeah.
Yeah. Or you give them things like stimulants, which don't have effects in your muscles in your central nervous system, and people like go farther, right?
Right.
Um, I think we only have a few minutes left, so I want to give you one lightning round thing, and then if you can read a passage
Great.
that I loved. You mentioned the four states of running that you consider bliss, and I thought this was another beautiful passage. And I wonder if I can mention each four, and you can just kind of tell me what that means in one
Yeah.
to three sentences. The first
Yeah.
one was meditation.
Say again, what was the first one?
Meditation was the first one.
So that's the main reason I run, and its ability to like, you run, you breathe into your nose, you out through your mouth, and it is very much like sitting there concentrating on your mind, but you let everything go. And that's the state I try to reach in the mountains. I love that state.
The second one is flow.
Flow is like, I mean, I now I'm about to say this one's actually my favorite state. This is where you're running hard, right? But you're not hurting. And so, like right now, if I can run a marathon at like 6 minute pace, like this is like 5:50 pace, right? And I can hold it for like 10 miles and I feel great, or 5:55 pace. And a few seconds faster and you're hurting and you're like struggling. But this, like, you just feel fast and strong and you've just, it's beautiful because you're fully concentrated on your body and you're working really hard without feeling the pain.
The third state is catharsis.
So catharsis is, it's a state that I don't, I can't remember the last time, but sometimes when you're in a lot of pain and sometimes something's gone wrong, it's good to go and just like push yourself. And there's something about like creating pain that it kind of pushes away pain or helps you process it. You know, when I wait a second. The example I give in the book is this guy, Michael Joyner, who's a friend of mine, who tells me that when he was having a divorce, he would go to the track and he would run the hardest intervals he'd ever run in his life. And it was a way to like, if he could create the pain, he could understand the pain he was going through.
And he's, by the way, like a very decorated physiologist and a good runner. And the final one is oneness.
So oneness is amazing. And that's like, you can't get it in a, I mean, maybe you can get it in a workout, but you have to push yourself so hard. But there's a state you get, or I get in running. And it's like the last few miles of a marathon, or maybe the longer one in an ultra where you're moving forward and you're moving forward well, right? And ideally you're still on your pace that you want. Everything's gone, right? And like there have been times, I remember I guess it was 2019 New York Marathon where I ran really well. And I remember I went through Central Park really fast. I was running like 5:50s through Central Park the last few miles of the race. And I couldn't see anything, right? And like I would have friends be like, on the sidelines or like with signs. You couldn't see. You have no peripheral vision. You have no hearing, right? You're just like, it's you and the road, and there's nothing beyond that. And that's a kind of a wild state, and you stay in it, and then you cross the finish line, and then you snap back, and you're there.
Hmm.
But that's a beautiful feeling to be in too.
Appreciate that,
I
Nick. And
had that actually. I ran the last time I had that was in this 50-mile race where I was running the 50-mile race, and I was trying desperately to set the American record. This was last April, so 9 months ago, and I held just perfect pace. I had to run like 6:35 or something. I held perfect pace for like 44 miles. And I remember the last few miles, like desperately holding on and like could feel nothing beyond it. And just like right foot, left foot, right foot, just trying like bring myself forward, bring myself forward. I didn't get the record, but it was a great mental experience to go through those last 6 miles.
I love that you close your eyes when you describe that you're like inhabiting your running body again.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, to close, I was wondering if you could read a passage that I mentioned to you just before this,
Yeah.
because I think it has a nice contrast of some of these different states of running, like some meditative and then some fiery and grinding.
Yeah. Great. I'm glad you picked this passage. Um, Sometimes I use running as a form of meditation. I put on my shoes and go out. I connect my watch to satellites and then try to disconnect my mind from the swirl inside. Eventually, I'm alone in my head. Sometimes I'll focus on a musical mantra 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, tracking my steps and making sure I keep my left and right feet alternating symmetrically on the downbeat. Other times, I focus on my breath or on the sound and motion around me, whether the blue jays in the Catskills or the trucks rumbling by on Broadway. Sometimes, as with all meditation, my attention wanders, like a stream flowing haphazardly through my mind, collecting sticks and carrying them until they wash to the side. When I run a workout, though, everything changes. I'm not trying to open my mind, I'm trying to close it. I shut out the blue jays and the trucks. I have to focus. If I'm with a training partner, I lock my attention on their shoulder if I'm behind or on their breath if I'm ahead. Usually, though, I'm on my own. I look for runners up the road and set imaginary races against them. Can I catch the lady in the purple sweatshirt before the second oak tree? Can I stay an even 20 meters behind the cyclist playing John Coltrane on a boombox? I check my watch and I try not to let my pace deviate from the goal. I try to identify the parts of my body that hurt, and then I push the pain away from them. I remind myself that I've run this fast before. Self-doubt is a smoldering fire. In a workout, the embers often flash. I don't want to give them any air. Every action we take helps to build our habits. Quit once, and it'll be easier to quit the second time too. I don't listen to music while I run. Every workout is a physical challenge. I'm trying to strengthen the muscles in my legs and my heart. But it's also a mental challenge. I'm trying to teach my body how to move quickly and with good coordination through space. Running is a process of learning about your body and developing habits deep inside it. Music can confuse the signals. I want to deepen my understanding of the relationship between my stride, my pace, my breath. I don't want a baseline or the adrenaline that can flow with it to get in the way.
I just think that's a beautiful passage and a good place to close. There's a lot more writing like that in the book, so highly recommend.
Awesome. David, you're an amazing interviewer. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick.
David, thank you so much. Ditto, you are just incredible. You always come so prepared and thoughtful and really just truly engaged. We're so grateful to you for your service to the fan community. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Nick, beautiful book. I think people might have joined in thinking they were going to get one thing and then they opened up several little surprise packages. So, and I want to tell folks, Nick is going to join us for after hours. We're going to run it from we're running a tiny bit late. We're going to run from about 8:03, 8:04 till 8:30. Come hang out, ask your own questions, whether about running, about your father's, son's, Holy Ghost, whoever you want to ask a question about, feel free. David's going to pop in for a minute and join us a little bit. He's got some other stuff he's got to do, but come join us. Just make a donation, a meaningful donation, your discretion, dollar amounts. Come hang out with us. Come learn more from these two really incredible human beings. Thanks, everybody, for joining us tonight. Hope to see you at more fan events this month. Thanks for your time tonight.